I would like to greet my fellow panelists here. I would like to introduce them at first, and then we'll have a special address and context setting. Uh, we have Katie. Thank you for being here. Katie is a Vice President, Corporate Affairs at EPRI. She provides executive direction and leadership for EPRI's external stakeholder relations and for communications in support of member engagement, marketing, media relations, and technical products. She brings to EPRI more than 25 years in the energy, water, and manufacturing industries and in the public sector. Most recently, she led the US Department of Energy Policy and Technology team responsible for transmission, permitting, and technical assistance in the department's Office of Electricity. She served as a key leader in expanding and diversifying the office's Electricity Advisory Council and responsibility for aligning research with clear benefits to the public. Thank you, Katie. I would like to introduce Tobias Fuchs. Mr. Fuchs is the Director for Climate and Environment Services at the German National Meteorological Services. He is also National User Coordinator and German User Representative in the European Union Copernicus Program User Forum with regard to the Copernicus Services Climate Change Monitoring and Atmosphere Monitoring, CAMS. Another role of his is Vice Chair of the Study Group Integrated Weather and Climate Services for Transition to Net Zero Energy of the World Meteorological Organization Services Commission. Thank you for being here. Michael Russell, thank you for representing the ACI World here. We welcome you here. Michael is Senior Vice President, International Relations at Airport Council International, ACI World. He has transformed ACI approach to advocacy on safety, security, environmental protection, and sustainability, and increased engagement with industry organizations like ICAO, CANSO, ICCAIA, IATA, WEF, WTTC, and other international organizations. As Corporate Secretary, he is responsible for legal compliance, governance, and management of the ACI World Governing Board. Which is made up of CEOs from airports around the globe. He has extensive experience of international civil aviation regulations, policies, have a direct impact on the safe, secure, and sustainable development of international civil air transport. We welcome you on board. Thank you. And another important panelist, Dr. Anvita Arora, thank you for being here. Anvita is a Program Director, Transport and Infrastructure at CAPSAC, which is an advisory think tank based working on energy, economics, and sustainability in Saudi Arabia. The department works on the energy transition pathways of road, rail, aviation, and maritime transport at the sectoral level and energy efficient and smart cities at the urban level. Before joining CAPSAC, she was the Managing Director and CEO of Innovative Transport Solutions, iTrans. Primary focus of her work has been on supporting cities to become sustainable, inclusive, and climate resilient. We welcome all the panelists here, and thank you for being here. I would like to invite our special guest here today to set the context for the session, Mr. Carlos Strome. Carlos Strome is a corporate lawyer specializing in administrative law and public administration, with a certificate in bidding and administrative contracts. In 2020, he was Municipal Secretary of Housing in the city of Sao Paulo, carrying out activities focused on housing, land regulations, and participating in programs of social interest. He monitored and directed the Favela Urbanization Program. He is currently National Secretary of Urban and Metropolitan Development at the Ministry of Cities in Brazil. We welcome you, sir. I request him to address the gathering, set the context for the session. Thank you.
Bom dia, senhoras e senhores.
Good morning, ladies and
Em
gentlemen.
nome do ministro das Cidades, Jader Filho,
In the behalf of the Minister of Cities, Jader Filho,
a quem deixam fraternal abraço,
I send to you a very fraternal hug.
teve compromisso inesperado a quem ele gostaria muito de comparecer neste momento.
He had an unexpected appointment commitment. He wished to be here, but he couldn't.
Saúdo todos os participantes e autoridades dessa sessão de alto nível para identificar as oportunidades da cooperação multinível para financiamento de urbanização no Brasil.
I greet all the participants, esteemed guests and panelists, to be part of this high-level opportunity event.
Cumprimento todas as autoridades e painelistas que estão aqui, na pessoa do Sr. Amit Proti.
I greet all the authorities and panelists in the person of Amit Proti.
Inicio minha fala trazendo a realidade da urbanização no Brasil.
I start my speech in bringing the reality of urbanization in Brazil.
Nossa urbanização se deu de forma acelerada e com isso trouxe graves consequências para as nossas cidades.
Our urbanization happened in a very expedited way, so brought us a lot of troubles and problems.
Ao concentrar pessoas e recursos em metrópoles e cidades médias,
Concentrating people and resources in metropolis and middle cities,
em faixas seletivas do território nacional, formando centralidades urbanas, muitas vezes com crescimento desordenados.
in selective ways in national territory, forming many times urban centralities and ordinated growing.
Hoje, mais de 85% da população brasileira vive em ambientes urbanos.
Today, more than 85% of the population, the Brazilian population, lives in urban context.
A urbanização brasileira se concentrou no litoral e em regiões sul e sudeste.
Brazilian urbanization concentrated in the shore and southeast region.
Neste cenário, hoje vivemos algumas situações alarmantes no país.
In this scenario, we have a lot of alarm situations in our country.
Secas no norte do país e inundações no sul.
Dries and floods in the north and south region.
Eu gostaria também de deixar como exemplo,
Like I can give you an example.
venho da cidade de São Paulo
I come from São Paulo city,
e recentemente passamos por inundações
and recently we have a huge flood
em funções de fortes chuvas,
because of rains and storms.
deixando 2 milhões de domicílios sem energia
And we had, for example, 2 million houses without power energy
por mais de uma
for
semana.
more than 1 week.
Isso demonstra que não podemos mais adiar as ações que tragam a resiliência para as cidades aos impactos climáticos.
And this shows that we cannot stop the actions that bring resilience to the cities and the impact of the climate.
Neste sentido, o presidente Lula retomou o Ministério das Cidades.
And in this sense, President Lula also brought back the Ministry of Cities.
O tema das cidades resilientes tem sido tratado com protagonismo nos programas e formas de financiamento.
The issue of the resilient cities has been treated as the protagonist in the programs and the financial projects,
Propondo, integrando a agenda urbana com a ambiental e colocando as cidades como tema central para a melhoria do meio ambiente.
as a proposal and integrating the urban issues and also the environment and putting the cities in the center focus of the problem.
Os financiamentos e os investimentos necessários, em grande medida, vêm do novo programa de aceleração do crescimento.
The financing, the funds, and the necessary investments comes from the new program of acceleration and growing.
Compostos por 9 eixos de atuação,
And it has 9 axes of activation,
dentre os quais, por responder por 80% dos investimentos previstos, destacam-se
in which they respond for 8% of the forecast investments, and we have in the middle of them
cidades sustentáveis e resilientes,
resilience and sustainable cities,
com a retomada do programa habitacional Minha
al-
Casa Minha Vida,
also bringing back the habitational program My House, My Life,
urbanização de favelas,
slums, urbanization,
mobilidade social sustentável,
sustainable social mobility,
gestão de resíduos sólidos, prevenção de desastres,
solid residual management,
contenção de encostas e drenagens e esgotamento sanitário,
contentions of drain systems and sanitary esgotement,
transição e segurança energética
transition and safety, energetical safety,
na ordem de 540 bilhões de reais,
in the house of 440 billion reais,
transporte eficiente e sustentável.
efficient transport and sustainable.
O novo PAC será executado mediante parceria do governo federal e do setor privado.
This new program will be executed together with the federal government and some private sector companies,
Estados, municípios e movimentos sociais.
states, cities, and social movements.
Estimados os investimentos na casa de 1,7 trilhão de reais.
And the investment are estimated to be around 1.7 trillion reals.
O maior investimento feito pelo governo brasileiro será estimado em 610 bilhões de reais no eixo cidades sustentáveis e resilientes,
From the government, we're going to have 610 billion reals, and it will be in the act of sustainable cities and resilient cities.
para a aquisição das unidades habitacionais a quem eu acabei de informar.
And that's for the acquisition of the housing program that I just spoke about it.
A agenda global sobre mudança de clima, mais e mais, destaca a importância de ações locais e do protagonismo urbano para a ação climática.
The global agenda about climate change brings a highlight of the importance in the local action and the protagonism of urban action and climate changing attendant.
Para dar eficiência ao novo modelo de desenvolvimento sustentável e inclusivo,
To bring efficiency to the new model of developing sustainable development and inclusive development
explicitado no novo plano de transformação ecológica,
that we brought in the new plan of eco transformation,
a estrutura e o funcionamento da administração pública federal em vigor,
the structure and the functioning of the new management public management of the government
incorporou o compromisso ambiental às políticas públicas sob sua responsabilidade.
brought a high commitment with the public politics about his own responsibility.
No Ministério das Cidades, estou à frente da Secretaria Nacional de Desenvolvimento Urbano e Metropolitano.
In the Ministry of Cities, I'm responsible for the Secretary of the Cities and Climate Changes,
a qual compete estabelecer diretrizes voltadas à adaptação das cidades à mudança climática,
and it's my responsibility to establish the ways back to adaptations of the cities and climate change.
O objetivo é promover a lente climática nas políticas e ações do desenvolvimento urbano.
The goal is to promote the climatical lens in the political actions of urban developing,
para tornarem a adaptação mais efetiva, articulada no território e com planejamento a longo prazo.
to make a more effective adaptation in the territory and the planning in the long run.
Esta ação deve considerar as obras de prevenção e respostas emergenciais a eventos climáticos extremos.
This action actually is to prevent and also work with fast response to the climate change extreme events,
Ao planejamento urbano, estratégico e integrado,
with strategy and integration,
associado aos cenários futuros que a mudança do clima traz a longo prazo.
associate with the future scenario that the climate change is bringing to the situation.
Assim, temos previsto para o ano de 2024
So to 2004,
a implementação do programa Cidades Melhores,
we have a program called Better Cities,
que tem como objetivo reduzir as desigualdades socioterritoriais,
and the goal is to reduce the disequality social territorials,
mediante o crescimento integrado,
promoting integrated growing,
democrático, acessível, inclusivo e sustentável,
sustainable, including, and accessible,
por meio de políticas de planejamento urbano integrado,
through integrated urban planning politics,
visando principalmente qualificar áreas centrais e áreas urbanas degradadas,
showing mainly to focus in areas, urban areas that are degraded,
com infraestrutura e serviços integrados.
with integrated services and infrastructure.
Estamos também em elaboração do programa Cidades Verdes e Resilientes,
We also have we are elaborating a program to have green cities and resilience,
que é uma colaboração e uma parceria entre outro ministério do governo brasileiro, que é o Ministério do Meio Ambiente e da Mudança do Clima,
It's a partnership of collaboration between two ministries, the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change and the Ministry of Cities, our ministry.
e também o Ministério da Ciência, Tecnologia e Informação.
Also, the Ministry of Science, Technology and Information.
Integrar as políticas urbana, ambiental e climática é essencial,
To integrate the urban policy, environmental, and climate changing is essential.
pois são nas cidades que a maior parte da população sentirá se os esforços de enfrentamento da questão climática foram bem ou mal sucedidos.
Because it is in the city that people will face if the efforts of these facing problems that we are having are really committed.
A compreensão das questões climáticas e de seus impactos nas cidades é necessária para aperfeiçoar a política urbana.
The comprehension of the climate changing questions and the impact in the cities are needed to perfect the policies, the urban policies and the actions in the national and local environment.
Por esse motivo, pretende-se construir uma estratégia de educação ambiental urbana com ações diversas.
So for these reasons, we intend to build a strategy of environmental education, of urbanization and many other actions,
Incluindo a trilha de aprendizagem sobre cidades e mudança do clima.
like the track of learning of climate change in cities.
Para tanto, relançamos um programa nacional que denominamos de capacidades,
For that, we reloaded a national program that we call Capacities.
como último ponto para que os municípios enfrentem os desafios climáticos.
As the last points for the cities to face in the challenges that we have with the new climate,
Gostaria de destacar que o Ministério tem incentivado e buscado financiamento para que os municípios proponham uma lente climática,
I would like to highlight that we are, the ministry is looking for financing to changing the proposal to a more climatical lens
no processo de elaboração ou revisão dos seus planos diretores.
in the process of elaboration or revision of the director plans.
Para isto, foi elaborado um guia no plano diretor,
And for that, we elaborate a guidance plan in the directive plan.
fruto do Projeto de Apoio Nacional do Desenvolvimento Urbano Sustentável, ANDUS.
It's a fruit of the National Project of Sustainable Development, ANDUS.
Ele traz uma metodologia
It brings a methodology,
flexível e adaptável
flexible and adaptable,
às múltiplas realidades brasileiras,
to the multiple realities that we have in Brazil,
para a elaboração de planos diretores
to the elaboration of directive plans,
e constitui o principal documento orientativo aos
and this is the
municípios.
main document to orient the cities.
Diante disso, reitero as palavras do ministro,
And before all of this, I say again the words of the ministry,
colocando o Ministério das Cidades de portas abertas para o diálogo e intercâmbio de experiências.
bringing our ministry, the Ministry of City, with open doors and open ears to the dialogue,
De modo a transformarmos juntos nossas cidades em cidades resilientes.
in a way to change our cities into resilient cities.
Agradeço novamente pela oportunidade de representar o governo federal do Brasil
I thank you everyone for the opportunity to represent the federal Brazilian government
nas pessoas do presidente da República, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva,
in the person of our president,
ministro das Cidades Jader Filho, neste diálogo e poder contribuir para o intercâmbio de políticas públicas para as cidades.
and also the Ministry of Cities, Jader Filho, in the way to contribute with the exchanging technology and knowledge with the public policies of the cities.
Meu muito obrigado e bom dia a todos.
Thank you very much and good morning to everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for those enlightening words and also highlighting on the initiatives you have taken in Brazil to integrate and enhance resilience in the Brazil, understanding the interdependency, interconnectedness of the systems in the urban area. With this, I want to highlight how the session, the panel represents the diverse transport sector and energy sector to connect the associated systems. And with this, I also apologize for not having one of our fellow panelists from representing the ports from Regina Certes, who is working also on climate resilience adaptation and DRI for the ports. Apologies, Regina, for the technical issues here. Now we go forward with our panel, and I request our moderator, Mr. Amit Proti, who is the Director General of CDRI, Coalition for Disaster Resilient of Infrastructure, to moderate on this. We welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I'm coming late, and that just shows that you can have the best standards and the best, but you may not meet them, and you need to find deviations, and my deviation was Kiran. Thank you so much for actually stepping in and moderating. Thank you, Secretary, for setting the context for why resilience is important, urbanization, the pace of urbanization that's going on, and how does one try to manage that through understanding of climate. So I'm going to turn, I think you are our scientist on the group, so I'm going to turn to our scientist.
Yeah.
Right? Tawais, right? Yes, perfect. So part of the challenge for us, all of us, is climate science is unpredictable right now. I mean, uncertain, right? We don't actually know exactly what is going to be the change. So how does one start to think about the science behind the changing environment, changing climate, and start to bring that into the policy framework? So maybe from your side, just what is the latest thinking, and how does one bring that science into standards? And I know we had a question for you, so please take that and go ahead with your answer.
Well, standards.
Yeah.
Okay. Standards are documents that outline best practice instructions, and it followed different people doing this. Now it's on, okay. And if followed the standards, different people doing the same task, also on policy, should get the same results. And that's what we do in science. Repeatable results or repeatable studies should get to similar results if you use the proper data. Currently, most of the infrastructure standards either assume a stable climate, which we know is not the case anymore, or include consideration of a historical climate using data from the last century. So usually maybe a means from 1951 until 2000, or 61 until 1990, or all those timelines, which is also not the case, as we all know. In changing climate, means and also extremes are changing. So best practices developed under the assumption of climate observed during the second half of the 20th century is not automatically the best practice. We need to design infrastructures and energy systems and transport systems in the 21st and following centuries. So we need to update existing standards or write new ones under consideration of future climate. So use the best available climate projection data, produce them, and prepare society by that for extreme weather and changing climate conditions to be expected, thereby aligning the energy and infrastructure resilience goals helps to create a more coherent response to climate challenges. So we need to include changing means, changing extreme events, and we do that from our case also in Germany. The Met Service is involved in a research activity. We belong to the Ministry of Transport in Germany, and we have a big research activity currently adjusting now the standards to the future climate in order to feed them into proper resilience of the transport infrastructure for the roads, for the railways, for the water transport, and so there's, and also for the energy systems, of course, in another study. And so this is really needs to be done. Yeah.
I think, do I need to use this? Maybe I do. Okay.
No.
All right. probabilistic science, right? We can't look at history, we can't look at past patterns. We actually have to start to come up with probabilistic science.
Yes.
And then we have a number of people here who are, from the energy sector, airport sector, urban sector,
Yeah.
starting to think about how does one use that emerging probabilistic science and then start to transform that into standards that you can build airports around, that you can build your energy systems around. So maybe I'll come to you first. For the energy sector side, I think you're representing the energy sector, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's correct.
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay. So, how are you starting to think about the climate science and projections and starting to bring that into your codes? Like, when you're thinking from resilience standards, resilience is still a very if I ask around this room, I'll probably get a very different perspective on what resilience is. And then to turn that into a pattern that is predictable and into standards is not something that's very easy to do. So I'm just curious from your perspective in the energy space, how are you starting to approach resilience standards?
Well, if I could start with where we've been and how the energy sector has evolved. So the energy infrastructure was built on affordability and safety. And then we looked at efficiency and reliability. So resilience was not part of the equation. And so now we're trying to introduce that. And for the past 100 plus years, we've managed to meet the standards and even exceed them, to the fact in some parts of the developing world, it's almost taken for granted. So how do we change the conversation? And so we are seeing momentum around that and thinking about how can we take the changes in wind speed, the temperature, how will that affect the infrastructure? So a useful standard, when we think about standards, depends on experience, a common understanding, and data. And so we're starting to get that now in the resilience realm, where we have some operational best practices. And as we come together, I would say that we have two of the three. The common understanding is the problem that's really vexing us today. And we're working on that at this moment. So collaboration will be key. I'm sorry, I realized I had my back to you. Collaboration will be key in developing these standards, this common understanding, because only by having that, it's multifaceted. We have many stakeholders, and we have to understand each other before we can even get to a standard.
So maybe back to the airport sector now, common understanding. How are you starting to think about common understanding, picking up and into your realm of resilience in the airport sector?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this. We have been thinking about resilience for quite some time. Let me just take a couple of steps back. ACI, Airports Council International, represents nearly 2,000 airports. Every airport is different, and if you sort of step back in history, there are unintended consequences of the way that some airports have been built and where some airports have been built. And sometimes it's helpful to think about airports as being small cities. So I've tried to sort of like frame a context to be thinking about airports. And let me give you a couple of examples as to where we start from and where we need to go to in terms of resilience. We start from the fact that a lot of airports were built close to the water so that they were away from the cities so that noise impacts were reduced. The consequence of that is that a lot of these airports are now vulnerable to sea rise and to storms, increased storminess. And I think that if you sort of look back a couple of years, I think that the storm at Kansai in Japan is probably one of the most serious impacts. And that was a brand new airport where resilience had already been built in. So we've got to think very carefully about where do we go from here. But I said to think about sea rise, I mean, that is the obvious consequence of climate change. But there are other consequences for airports, and hot and high is one of these, is that in well, not Central America, but in the center of America, so we're talking about Phoenix here, is that, again, a couple of years ago, the temperatures were so high that it was impossible for large aircraft to take off because they had not been certified for taking off on that length of runway. So again, when we think about airports, we've got to think about different circumstances. And this is why I would argue that for airports, it's very difficult to think about standards. There are already standards that exist with respect to infrastructure. But what we have got to think about is more sort of guidance in terms of best practice. And you mentioned best practice for the electricity sector. We in ACI have already produced best practice for our members. And there are two things that they need to be thinking about, and then I will stop because I realize that others want to talk as well. But we can come back to this. First of all, there is the question about building in your resilience as you construct your airport. So you've got to think about that in terms of your infrastructure development. And that's where climate trends need to be taken account. Yes, we don't know what is going to happen precisely, but we do have a very good idea of what those trends will be, and we've got to prepare for those. And the second part is that we've got to build in recovery. And that means that with the best resilience that we have in the world, the master plans for the airports have to take account of what do we do even if we have got resilience built in or we have added resilience after. And we can talk about that as well later in the panel if that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think thank you for introducing this recovery aspect, because often when we talk about infrastructure, when infrastructure fails, the numbers that we see around is usually the asset failure. Insurance companies will come back and say $100 billion of asset, has to be paid back this year, etc. But the whole disruption to services, right? And when we talk about resilience, I think the thinking also has started to be that you can't reinforce everything to withstand whatever we are going to face in the future, right? So how do you then think about reducing the disruptions to services? And that's recovery quickly without, so they may be, so accepting failure at some level, right? Accepting that something will not work for a little bit.
If I may just quickly go back on that very point, is that Kansai was built with massive resilience against earthquakes. It was built with seawall protection against a 100-year storm, and yet still those storm protections were breached. But in terms of recovery, they were back into full operation 17 days after that inundation. So it really is all in the planning.
Yeah. And we're starting to do some work in the port space, and what we're realizing is that every day a port is not functioning, the cost is $100,000 plus on a daily basis. So you have to start thinking about recovery. I'm going to come to you. You're the researcher on the panel today. So let's.
A scientist and a researcher now.
Excellent. So the scientists are sitting together. That's not a very good thing. we need to distribute the science with the policymakers. That's how it works. Tell us a little bit about your policy and research that's going on in this currently, and that starts to relate to standards.
I think a couple of things in the mobility space, especially if we look at urban mobility, it starts becoming very complicated because climate data is very, let's say, regional or spatial, and that doesn't lead to action plans because you cannot attribute who are the culprits, what needs to change, and things like that. The second thing which we find more and more in our research is that we are missing out on embedded carbon, embedded issues. I mean, there is little understanding of the whole supply chain, right? And of the policies that are made or plans that are made are very, let's say, local, and they are not taking into account the entire chain of moving of goods and production, etc. So one of the, I think, useful ways, which is again a way you can embed standards, is to look at a life cycle analysis approach. So when we look at a life cycle analysis approach, especially in mobility, we are able to identify how are things moving, where are they moving, what are the points where shocks can happen and hence issues, and where are they producing more emissions. So we are using life cycle analysis not only for emissions, but to identify whole value chains in mobility systems. I think that's where research needs to have bottom-up models, especially in the transportation sector, as well as top-down model. And unfortunately, climate data often is very top-down. It doesn't look at a bottom-up building. So I think integrating both of them is critical, and we can talk more on that as we go down. Yeah.
Secretary, would you like to take a question? No. Okay. All right. Tobias, then back to you. Now we've just heard embodied carbon.
Yeah.
We've not really spent a lot of time in the adaptation space necessarily, because we're talking about resilience a little bit today.
Yes.
But they are linked. I mean, you can't avoid thinking about embodied carbon when you're thinking about safety measures in terms of the concrete being used for seawalls, or there is actually a linkage. Mm-hmm. And the reason I emphasize that is when we think about hazards, we can't. You just mentioned, the airport was ready for earthquakes, mm-hmm. but then maybe a hurricane hit. Like we're actually seeing this more and more. We're doing some work now in Haiti with the building codes. The new building codes are completely ready for earthquakes, but then they haven't actually addressed hurricanes, right? So our risk profiles are changing. The whole complexity of hazards it's no longer looking at it from just one dimension. It's multiple dimensions. And it's starting to sort of, not push us, but we need to start thinking about connection of systems. This happens often. Your power system fails and the telecommunication system fails and your hospitals can't work, etc. So, for you,
yes.
This interconnectedness of systems, right?
Yes.
How are you starting to think about the science, the meteorological understanding, and how are you starting to look at that from the climate data contributing to an understanding of this interconnectedness of systems and cascading effects of an extreme event?
Of course, you have to address this in a multi-hazard way. So you cannot alone address one hazard, but you have to consider the cascading effects, and compound effects also of hazards. So as we experience also in my country, we have some heavy precipitation. This triggers floods. This triggers also landslides, and they block roads, they block highways, and for several times. So you need to consider then that these effects are connected. And so also with your climate data, you need to address then some robustness of data, and you need to learn from the past. So you need to investigate past events based on best available climate monitoring data to deeply look into the triggering of these events and what you can learn about that then from data adjustment, also feeding climate resilience standards. And so I think this is very important then to use data sets also like reanalysis. This is a new data sets now. They are frozen weather forecast models. They can be fed by many different observation data, and they provide the real structure then also of the climate system based on the models, of course, on the climate models. And these are data sets now adjusted and developed now to being fed also into resilience standards. And so I think, and this is also really important, not to think in a single way, I address one hazard in this way, another hazard in that way, but that the combination is important. And as we heard also, the impact of heat also on airports. Heat is an also multi-impact event. It addresses, of course, the impacts the flight business. It impacts the health sector, where we have strong impact. It addresses also the energy systems, energy production, energy transmission is impacted, of course, and reduced. And so you need to have in your science and in your data sets, you need to more properly look into this multi-cascading effects also.
So can you pick that up on the energy sector?
Yeah.
Because there is a direct correlation. Like talk about heat now.
Oh yes, very much so. So when we think of the interconnectedness of the energy sector, so years ago we thought about an integrated electricity system, and now we're looking to electrify so much more industry, transport, and buildings. And so now we're thinking about an integrated energy network. And so heat, there's multiple aspects to that. So when the assets operate, when you think of a distribution line, the hotter it is, the more it will sag. But then you have wind as a factor too. So if there's no wind, it'll sag even more. And so we're looking at, we have an initiative called Climate Ready. And READY is for resilience, RE, adaptation, AD, little I for initiative. So are we going to be ready for these climate changes both today and tomorrow? And we've identified over 30 variables that we think that would impact the calculation of just the assessment of the risk. And so when we think of risk, it's not just the variables of the climate that might impact it, but it's also the vulnerability of the system in itself, which was designed. Many of those standards were from like the 50s in the US, and in some areas they're newer. But then there's also the consequence. So when you are electrifying more, it's more regional. And so now you have more stakeholders, more different types of infrastructures, and understanding how it will, the interdependencies on how it will affect it will greatly change the value equation. So how are we going to value the impact of a disruption as we continue to electrify in this transition?
So that's a case study we would love to see, because talking about case studies, those are exactly the kinds of case studies we need to start seeing. Coming back to airports again, I remember very famously an airport that declared it was 100% based on renewable energy. It was a fantastic goal, and they achieved it. It was all solar farms. And then the solar farms flooded. And then, that airport had to rely on the traditional grid, right? So from your perspective, this whole interconnectedness of systems, how are airports thinking about it?
So it's a really good question, is because, as I said at the beginning, every airport is different, so every airport thinks in different ways in accordance to their standards and their circumstances. And the issue with airports is that decarbonization is absolutely essential. And the idea of solar farms, wind farms, renewable energy is really important. The airports agreed to a net zero carbon target by 2050. And that applies to Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So that's both their own emissions and also the emissions from the electricity grid. We have some airports who are very, very much more proactive than others. Mostly, however, they will continue to have a link to the grid. And so that interdependency is one whereby they will generate their own power in times when they can do so. They will store their own power where they can do so. But there are going to be times when they are trying to sell power back to the grid, and there are going to be times when they're going to be taking power from the grid. And so that question of interdependency is actually really important. I will give you another example of where you try to establish that resilience, but mistakes have been made. And one such case is where there was an airport and it had done everything right. It had got a backup power system. So when the grid failed, as sometimes it does, they had their backup power system and they got their generators running and everything was fine, except they didn't have enough fuel because they hadn't planned and they hadn't got the resilience for the length of that power cut. And so they ran out of fuel. And this was because it was diesel power. Now, if they'd powered these things with aviation fuel, then they've got plenty of that, but they couldn't run the generators using aviation fuel. They were looking for diesel, and the diesel ran out. So even though you plan and you've got the best sort of ideas of how you're going to increase your resilience, you've still got to go through this, how do we address even the worst possible cases, which may be a lot worse than you even thought they were going to be. And that applies across the board.
I think, and you touched upon this earlier also, the guidelines aspect.
Yeah.
Right. So when we talk about standards, and Brazil is not very dissimilar to India in terms of cities that there are standards, and then there are a lot of parts of the cities that actually don't meet those standards. And this is applicable in a lot of the urban context, but also in the infrastructure context. You can actually come up with very rigorous standards, but then also starting to think about there will be places where standards you may not be able to meet them. And what do you do in those contexts? And how does then guidelines come in as a way of then saying, okay, this is a hard and fast rule. You can't compromise on safety. But then here are different ways of thinking about reducing your disruption. You want to respond to that?
Yeah, because I think this is important, is that standards have their place. But I'm trying to sort of, and I think that you're getting this, is that there are times when standards are just impossible. There's no point in having an earthquake standard for all airports, because we don't need it. There's no point having a flooding standard for all airports. We don't need it. And you've got to sort of think about the right place for standards, and you mentioned safety. Through the International Civil Aviation Organization, we've got 11,000 different standards and recommended practices, I will say. So we cover, airports, airlines, operations, and all of that is already covered by those kinds of standards. But I think that we're into new territory here. And we've got existing building standards, and we follow those. Of course we do, in terms of the development of the infrastructure. But our investments in infrastructure are massive. They are lumpy. They last, there's a lot of money up front. This infrastructure then has to last for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. You think about a runway, you think about a terminal. So we follow all the necessary building standards, but in terms of resilience, then it's going to be each depending on their particular circumstances. And researchers, please, the more data that we have, the better we can plan for the future. And I think that probably goes for the energy industry as well.
Oh, absolutely. And if I could just mention with data, like much of our data, historical data, we're looking backwards because an event happens and it's like, oh my gosh, we have to do something about it. Well, now we've got more data, so we can start looking forward and try to be more proactive. In energy, we are used to looking out 10 years, but like you said, our assets might operate for 40 years, 100 years even. And so we've got to, as we modernize our grids or even build them, we need to have that longer term thinking and really look at that data. And when it comes to climate data, the energy sector needs to know what the environment will be within a mile. And we're trying to take it down. But climate science is not, it's much bigger, it's global. So we're working with a huge collaborative in order to try and find a way to get that science down to that closer local level.
I want to pick up a point that was raised, and I think it's very critical about standards. I think, like you said, you can't have earthquake standards for every airport because each airport is not earthquake prone. I think what is happening now with standards, especially we see in the mobility systems, standards start to become technology prescriptive. And that is a real problem. One is they are out of context in many places because they are often developed in a context where that technology is available, is cheap, or it's desirable for business reasons, etc. And when you start applying, and often in the developed world, those standards are developed, and then you start applying it in the developing world, which may have completely different pathways, completely different contexts, availability, technology. So I think avoiding technology prescriptiveness of standards is critical, and I think we should agree on the end games. So standards should agree on how much pollution you need to bring down, how much GHG emissions you need to bring down, not prescribe these technology pathways. So a lot of the work that we are doing at CAPSAC is also using multiple ways of having index like a CCE index we have, or looking at LCA, looking at ways to have pathways. You know, it's like all roads can lead to Rome, and you don't have to have one narrow tunnel where everybody needs to focus on. The second problem is in the transportation system, what we don't see is that there are standards for shipping, and then there are these standards for the airports, and then there are the standards for your urban systems, rail, etc. And they are all vying for the same energy systems. So, you know, there is a competitiveness within the transport, or just the mobility sector. I'm not even going to industry, I'm not going to, you know, other parts of the infrastructure, within the mobility system. So we were talking to, you know, shipbuilders, and they were saying we can create ships which run on hydrogen. Will you have enough hydrogen available for us? Because even the airlines are thinking of it, and the trucks are thinking of it, and the cars are thinking of it. And so when we start looking at these different technologies, you have to also, the interconnectedness, again, coming back to that point that you were making, you have to look at it at a very, the interconnectedness and a competitive space also when you make these standards. And very often the standard making agencies are only focused on their sector.
Yeah, I think, so I come from the water space,
Yeah.
you know, and same thing in the water space.
Yeah.
For flooding, urban in cities,
Yeah.
the solution often is concrete drains, right? I mean, I've seen enough examples where
Yeah.
you're trying to solve a flood problem and you build concrete drains. Concrete has embodied carbon.
Yeah.
Concrete, actually, the way it works, you can end up in downstream flooding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where performance-based standards, right? What you're
Yeah.
saying. The idea is to reduce flooding,
Yeah.
not to prescribe how to do it,
Yeah.
right? And that flexibility needs to be at least in some infrastructure systems.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of time, and I know that there are other sessions. So maybe, Secretary, do you want to offer some final words? You can stand up.
Tá embaixo.
Gostaria de agradecer a
I would-
oportunidade.
I would like to say thank you for the opportunity.
Foi muito importante o Brasil ouvir as questões de outros países, as realidades de outros
It's
países.
really important for Brazil to listen to the reality of other areas and countries.
O Brasil é um país continental,
We have a very big continental country.
com muitas diferenças. Da cidade onde eu nasci, são 12 milhões de habitantes,
I've been born in a city of 12 million people.
mas temos cidades de 3, 4 mil pessoas, com
But
realidades muito distintas.
We have short and small cities of 3,000 or 4,000 people, for example.
E nos deparamos com as realidades aqui que foram apresentadas.
And we face ourselves and we compare to the realities that the panelists brought to us.
E agradecemos, levaremos as considerações,
We're going to bring all this consideration back to Brazil.
e o Brasil está de volta para o diálogo, está de volta para a construção de políticas públicas com o mundo.
And we want to say that Brazil is back to the dialogue with the world, and Brazil is back to build international and togetherness with all the other departments and states of the world.
E muito importante lembrar
And it's very important to remember
que nos vemos em breve na COP30 em Belém do Pará.
that we see all together in COP30 in Belém do Pará, our city in the north region of Brazil.
E aí vocês vão poder entender em loco o local que é a Amazônia.
And then you're going to be able to understand in locum what is the Amazonia region in Brazil
Muito obrigado a todos.
and the challenge. Thank you so much for everybody.
WMO that has been a partner in setting up this panel. I think the conversation here is very early in a certain sense because we are still going to, resilience is still very new when it comes to standards. But number of things that got highlighted today is something we're going to see a lot more of. The whole notion of interconnectedness. How do you set standards for one system, but also recognize that that system is dependent on other systems? So you have to have standards that are interconnected. The whole notion of how standards have to be put together as performance-based, or are you prescribing technology, given that technology is also changing very, very quickly. So should we focus on performance and let the technology be decided locally or contextually, but having certain sense of this is what we want to achieve? The third part on standards, not just being regulations and rules, but also guidelines. And the fourth one we didn't come across today, but I would also touch upon is capacity. I think people to be able to then take this, if you have performance-based standards, you need people who can actually then apply them correctly. If you have guidelines, then taking the capacity to then take a guideline and put something down which actually works for what you're trying to achieve. Please welcome me. Please help me thank the panelists. I think they've done a very good early morning. 9 o'clock is never easy at the COP, especially on the first 2 days. So, I'm the one who came late, so apologies for that again. But thank you for all of the panelists, and let's take a group photograph.